The red light on the National Court Network camera blinked, signaling to 12 million Americans that history was about to unfold live. Inside Chicago's federal courthouse, tension snapped like a live wire. A woman in a tailored navy blazer walked calmly down the marble hallway. Officer Brian Carter stepped into her path, his hand already on his baton. "Restricted area. Ma'am. Move along." The microphones picked up every syllable, sending his bark into living rooms nationwide. The woman didn't flinch. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her blazer, and looked straight into the camera lens through the courtroom doors. Her voice was steady, sharp as glass. "Then perhaps you should check who's presiding over that proceeding." Seconds later, the nation gasped as Officer Carter slammed her head into the oak courtroom door with a crack so loud it echoed through the live broadcast. Blood spread across the marble floor. What America didn't yet know was that the woman bleeding before them wasn't just any victim. She was the judge about to decide the fate of men, exactly like the ones who had just attacked her. The red light on the National Court Network camera blinked alive, a tiny pulse of electricity that carried the weight of 12 million pairs of eyes. Across the United States, families paused their breakfasts, office workers muted their Zoom calls, and bartenders turned up the volume on mounted flat screens. It wasn't just another trial. It was the trial everyone had been talking about for months. The case that symbolized whether America could hold its own enforcers accountable. In the marble halls of the Chicago Federal Courthouse, echoes of hurried footsteps and clipped conversations carried through vaulted ceilings. Reporters lined the corridor, clutching notepads and phones, whispering into cameras. Court officers moved briskly in pressed uniforms, checking credentials. A faint hum of anticipation pulsed beneath the polished chandeliers and the scent of waxed oak benches. Judge Cassandra Miller walked calmly down that hallway, every step a measured act of control. She wore a navy blazer over a cream blouse, tailored slacks, and low black heels, an outfit chosen carefully, not to flaunt power, but to embody composure. Beneath her arm she carried a leather briefcase, worn at the edges but meticulously polished. Inside rested her judicial robe, folded with the reverence of a priest's vestments. To the world outside, Cassandra was a figure of respect and authority. To herself, in this moment, she was also a daughter. Today's trial was about the death of Robert Miller, her father, a retired sergeant who had spent 25 years in uniform before being gunned down during what police later called a routine stop. Cassandra had rehearsed this day in her mind for 3 years. She had imagined facing the lawyers, imagined reading evidence into the record. What she had not imagined was being treated like a trespasser in her own courthouse. Officer Brian Carter spotted her first. He was in his early 40s, a career cop with the hard-jawed face of someone used to being obeyed. The lines around his eyes weren't from laughter. They were from squinting at suspects beneath flashing red and blue lights. He stepped forward with a suddenness that startled 2 nearby reporters. His boots struck the marble with authority. His hand went instinctively to the baton clipped at his hip. "Restricted area. Ma'am," he barked, his tone sharp enough to slice the hum of the hallway. "You need to move along." The microphones embedded in the courtroom doors picked up every word, amplifying them across the National Court Network broadcast. Viewers at home stiffened. The moment didn't feel routine. Cassandra stopped, posture straight, face calm. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer like brushing away dust, a gesture more symbolic than practical. Her eyes, dark, clear, unwavering, met Carter's. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, resonant against marble walls, "I have every right to be here." Her words traveled not only to Carter's ears, but also through the microphones into 12 million homes. "Somewhere in Atlanta," a grandmother whispered, "that woman knows her rights." In Los Angeles, a law student scribbled down the exchange, already thinking of how it might appear in tomorrow's lecture. Carter's partner, Officer Daniel Brooks, joined him, taller, bulkier. His presence filled the narrow space in front of the courtroom doors. The tactic was deliberate, drilled into him during years of presence training. Form a barrier. Make the civilian feel small. His lips curved into a sneer. "Lady, I don't care what you think your rights are," Brooks said. "This is a federal proceeding, and you're disrupting it. Move." Cassandra turned her head slightly. Through the glass inset of the double doors, she could see the silhouette of camera equipment and the faint glow of stage lighting. She knew exactly where the primary broadcast lens was positioned. With quiet deliberation, she looked directly into it, her gaze locked on the audience at home, as if addressing them personally. "Then perhaps," she said clearly, "you should check who's presiding over that proceeding." In living rooms across America, viewers leaned forward. Something electric hung in the air. Even seasoned anchors felt their spines stiffen. Carter's jaw clenched. He had encountered this type before, or so he thought. People who questioned authority. People who thought a degree or a title gave them immunity from the rules. In his mind, such people needed a reminder of who truly controlled public spaces. "Are you threatening a police officer?" he demanded, his voice rising an octave. "Because that's a felony, sweetheart." The word sweetheart was a slap audible to millions. Civil rights attorneys watching from their offices reached for legal pads. The casual misogyny was itself evidence of disrespect. Inside, Cassandra's mind flickered briefly to her father. Robert Miller had always told her, "Never show fear. Fear is what they use to control you. Even bleeding inside, you keep your spine straight." She kept her tone calm, judicial. "Officer Carter," she said, reading his nameplate with precision. "I am not threatening anyone. I am exercising my constitutional right to enter this courtroom." "Akana," Brooks laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. "Constitutional right? Lady, you've been watching too much TV. Real life doesn't work like that." But real life was exactly what 12 million Americans were watching. In real time, newsroom producers were already whispering to anchors, "Flag this. Keep the feed live. Something's happening." Inside the courtroom, attorney Rachel Evans flipped through her opening notes but paused at the raised voices filtering through the oak doors. Bailiff Anthony Harris, a veteran of courthouse tensions, shifted closer to the entrance, hand resting on his radio. He'd seen how quickly routine confrontation spiraled. His instincts prickled. Back in the hallway, Carter's patience evaporated. To him, this wasn't a discussion anymore. It was insubordination. He saw Cassandra's calm demeanor not as discipline, but as defiance. "Ma'am," he said through gritted teeth, "last chance. Move along, or I'll place you under arrest for interfering with a federal proceeding." Cassandra felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She had prosecuted murderers, defended the innocent, presided over cases that reshaped law, but never had she been treated as a trespasser in her own hall of justice. "Officer," she replied softly, but with iron beneath the words, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach." Huckernot, Brooks stepped closer, breath heavy, invading her personal space. "And I strongly advise you to listen when a cop gives you an order." Inside the courtroom, one of the cameramen adjusted his rig toward the sound. The engineers dialed up the gain. The feed was alive, recording every syllable. In the National Court Network studio, anchor Lauren Mitchell pressed a finger to her earpiece. "Ladies and gentlemen," she told viewers, her voice careful, "we're hearing a disturbance outside the courtroom. We'll continue to monitor." Carter's hand dropped to his cuffs. Brooks angled his body to block any escape. The air thickened, the way it does before lightning strikes. "That's it," Carter snapped, adrenaline surging. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business." Cassandra straightened, dignity radiating from every inch of her posture. "Officer Carter, I am not interfering with—" "Shut up!" Carter's roar cracked against the marble, loud enough to make two journalists flinch. The microphones carried it perfectly into the broadcast feed. Millions heard the contempt. Without warning, he lunged, grabbing Cassandra by both shoulders. His grip was vice-like, fingers digging through fabric and flesh. Shock flared in her chest, not just at the sudden violence, but at the familiarity. This was how it had begun for her father. A routine encounter turned brutal in an instant. "Officer, stop!" she commanded, her tone carrying the authority of the bench. But Carter wasn't listening. Years of drilled instinct told him, control through force. Brooks grabbed her right arm, pinning it. Together, the two men forced her backward. Inside, Harris recognized the sounds of a struggle. He pushed through the doors, just as the climax erupted. "Get her against the wall." "Masramanas," Brooks shouted, as though subduing a dangerous criminal rather than a composed woman in professional attire. Carter's knuckles whitened with pressure. "I told you what would happen if you didn't listen," he growled. With a violent shove, he slammed Cassandra against the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. The crack reverberated through the hall, into the microphones, across the broadcast. It was the sound of bone and wood colliding, amplified into millions of living rooms. People watching from Florida to Oregon winced in unison. Her head struck the brass nameplate, Judge Cassandra Miller. Neither officer had bothered to read it. The metallic impact echoed, then silence, then the horrifying image of Cassandra collapsing to the marble floor. Blood pooled instantly, dark against the pristine white stone. In a bar in Detroit, someone shouted, "That's assault!" In a classroom in Boston, students gasped aloud. Phones lit up. Hashtags began forming in real time. Bailiff Harris burst through the doors, eyes widening at the sight of Cassandra lying motionless, blood spreading around her head. "What the hell happened here?" His hand shot to his radio. "Medical assistance, FBI backup. Now!" Carter stood over her, chest heaving. "Suspect was resisting arrest," he muttered in the monotone of a man rehearsed in falsifying reports. "She became combative, fell during restraint." Brooks nodded, voice steady. "She was erratic. We used minimum necessary force." But their words were meaningless. Every second had been captured. Every sound transmitted. 12 million witnesses had already seen the truth. Inside the studio, anchor Lauren Mitchell clutched her desk. "Ladies and gentlemen," she whispered, barely containing disbelief, "we may have just witnessed an unprovoked assault outside the courtroom." On Twitter, hashtags surged, "Conscious Justice for Judge." On TikTok, clips replayed the impact in slow motion. Civil rights attorneys began typing emergency filings. On the floor, Cassandra stirred faintly. Pain radiated from her skull, metallic blood filling her mouth. But her mind, razor sharp, clung to one thought. "I will not let this be buried." "Briefcase," she whispered, voice faint. Harris crouched. "Ma'am, don't move. You've got head trauma." "My briefcase," she repeated. Each syllable cost effort, but urgency burned behind it. The leather case lay a few feet away, its contents spilled. Pens, files, the folded black robe. Harris fetched it, confusion mixing with respect. "What do you need, a judge?" he asked softly, instinctively shifting titles even before the reveal. Cassandra's hand, trembling but determined, reached inside. She withdrew the robe. The black fabric unfurled like a banner. Gasps rippled through the hallway. Reporters covered mouths. Court staff froze. Even Brooks and Carter faltered. With Harris's help, Cassandra rose unsteadily, blood streaking her face but spine unbent. She draped the robe over her shoulders. The cameras captured every movement. "I am Judge Cassandra Miller," she declared, her voice hoarse yet commanding. "I was scheduled to preside over this proceeding today." The silence that followed was absolute. A silence so heavy that even the drip of her blood on marble carried like a drumbeat. Millions of viewers sat stunned. Carter's face drained of color. Brooks muttered, "Oh, God." Cassandra stood, robe dark against her bloodied blouse, eyes blazing. "And what you have just witnessed," she said into the lens, "is exactly why justice must be served." The broadcast cut to a close-up, her face resolute despite injury. A symbol had been born in real time, and America knew it. The hallway was still buzzing with shock when paramedics finally pushed through the swelling crowd. The sound of latex gloves snapping, medical bags unzipping, and radios crackling filled the marble corridor that minutes earlier had been serene. Reporters lifted their phones high above the crush of bodies, live streaming to their own feeds. Millions more viewers across America were still glued to the National Court Network broadcast, unwilling to blink for fear of missing a single moment. Judge Cassandra Miller, robe now draped over her blood-stained blouse, stood swaying slightly as the paramedics tried to lower her onto a gurney. She resisted with the stubbornness of someone who had lived through too many moments of intimidation. "I said I will stand," she repeated, voice clipped but unwavering. "You may tend to my injury when this is finished." One of the paramedics, a young man barely in his 20s, hesitated. His hands shook slightly as he looked at her forehead, where blood still seeped from the gash just above her brow. "Your Honor," he stammered, the title finally spoken aloud. "You've lost a lot of blood. Please, let us—" Cassandra raised one hand, palm outward. "Later. Right now. This nation needs to see exactly why we are here." Attorney Rachel Evans, who had been standing at the courtroom doorway, finally pushed through to her side. Rachel's chestnut hair clung to her face with sweat, her hands clutching a folder that she had nearly dropped in the chaos. Her mind, sharpened by years of legal battles, was already racing. She saw what this moment meant. The assault wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a mirror of the very injustice they were about to expose. "Judge Miller," Rachel said firmly but respectfully, "if you insist on continuing, then let's take it inside. Let the courtroom see. Let the jury see. They need to know what happened out here." Cassandra nodded once. She gripped the edges of her robe tighter, using it to steady herself as much as to declare her identity. With Bailiff Harris on one side and Rachel Evans on the other, she stepped toward the doors. The oak creaked as Harris pushed them open, revealing the packed courtroom beyond. Cameras swung on their mounts, capturing the sight of Cassandra's blood-streaked face beneath the dignified folds of her robe. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Some spectators covered their mouths. Others clutched each other's arms. "All rise," Harris announced hoarsely, his voice breaking with the emotion of what had just unfolded. "The Honorable Judge Cassandra Miller presiding." The room stood. The defendants at the table, officers Kevin Murphy and James Wilson, shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tide of history had turned against them. They had expected a trial that might drag for weeks, contested evidence, arguments to muddy the water. They hadn't expected their presiding judge to walk in battered and bloodied from police violence just outside the door. Cassandra ascended the bench slowly, every step deliberate. She lowered herself into the chair, wincing slightly as the gash in her forehead throbbed. The bandage one paramedic had managed to tape over it was already stained red. But her eyes, sharp as steel, scanned the room and found the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice steady, "today was meant to be about one act of police violence. Instead, it has become about two, one that occurred 3 years ago, and one that occurred 30 minutes ago, in this very courthouse." The jurors leaned forward. The cameras zoomed closer. "3 years ago," Cassandra continued, her words deliberate, "my father, Robert Miller, a retired police sergeant with 25 years of honorable service, was killed during what officers claimed was a routine traffic stop." A collective gasp rolled through the gallery. The revelation hit like thunder. The judge who had just been assaulted was not just any judge. She was the daughter of the victim whose case they were here to try. Inside homes across America, viewers sat frozen. On social media, hashtags shifted instantly. "Justice for Robert Miller." "Judge Miller." "Justice for both." Cassandra inhaled slowly, steadying herself against the wave of emotion threatening to break. She had practiced this speech in her mind for 3 years. but the reality of speaking it with blood trickling down her cheek was almost unbearable. My father was accused of resisting arrest. They said he reached for a weapon. They filed reports painting him as a dangerous criminal. But we know the truth, and today, you will see it with your own eyes. Rachel Evans rose smoothly from her table, seizing the moment. Your Honor, with the court's permission, the prosecution is prepared to play the body camera footage that captures Robert Miller's final moments. Cassandra gave a single nod. Proceed. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly as a technician activated the large monitor mounted beside the jury box. A timestamp appeared. March 15, 2021, 8:47 p.m. The audio crackled to life. The video showed a quiet residential street, children's playground equipment faintly visible under streetlights. Robert Miller's silver sedan was pulled to the side, engine still running. His hands were visible on the steering wheel, calm and steady. "Good evening, sir," came the voice of Officer Kevin Murphy, recorded by his own camera. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Robert's voice, deep and respectful, filled the courtroom. "No, officer, I don't. I was driving the speed limit and following all traffic laws." Jurors glanced at each other as they listened. He sounded calm, cooperative. The prosecution let the footage run. "Your left tail light is out," Murphy replied, but the video clearly showed both lights glowing red when the car stopped. Robert responded politely. "Officer, I just had my car inspected last week. I don't believe there's anything wrong with my taillights." Rachel Evans stepped forward, narrating for the jury. This was the moment when a routine traffic stop began transforming into a death sentence. On screen, Murphy's tone hardened. "Are you arguing with me?" The jury could hear Robert's answer. Still calm, still steady. "No, sir. I'm just explaining." From the passenger side, Officer James Wilson's voice chimed in. "We've got a resistant subject here. Kevin." The courtroom murmured. Robert had done nothing but answer a question. Yet already the officer's language framed him as a threat. The video continued. Murphy barked, "Step out of the vehicle!" "Officer, may I ask why?" Robert's voice was almost weary, like someone who had lived through enough encounters to recognize the danger of escalation. "If this is about a tail light, couldn't you just write me a citation?" It was a reasonable question, a lawful question, but the officers didn't see it that way. "Step out, or I'll remove you myself," Murphy snapped. Robert tried again. "Officer, I am a retired police sergeant. I served this city for 25 years. I understand procedure. Please, let's handle this properly." Gasps rose in the courtroom as the revelation sank in. A fellow officer, a man who had worn the same uniform. "But on the video," Wilson shouted back, "I don't care if you're the chief of police. When we give an order, you obey." Rachel Evans looked at the jury. And that was the moment any professional courtesy, any acknowledgement of Robert Miller's lifetime of service, was obliterated by bias and anger. On screen, Robert moved slowly, deliberately. "I'm reaching for my wallet," he said loudly, hands still visible. "I want to show you my retired ID. It's in my back pocket." He shifted carefully, one hand reaching toward his pocket. The video froze for a moment at Rachel's signal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said quietly, "this is where the officers claim Robert Miller reached for a weapon, but you will see with your own eyes what actually happened." The video resumed. Robert pulled out a worn leather wallet. The edge of his badge glinted faintly. "Gun!" Murphy shouted suddenly. "Gun!" Wilson echoed. Both drew their service pistols. "No, no, it's my wallet," Robert cried, his voice rising for the first time. "I'm showing you my police ID." Jurors flinched as the audio crackled with 3 gunshots. Robert collapsed, face first, onto the asphalt. His wallet clattered beside him. The camera caught his final words. "Please don't shoot. I have grandchildren." The footage ended. The screen went black. Silence crushed the courtroom. Several jurors covered their mouths, tears brimming. In the gallery, spectators sobbed openly. Even the stenographer's hands trembled as she tried to type. Cassandra sat motionless on the bench, her bandage stained but her eyes dry. She had forced herself to watch the footage countless times, each time like swallowing glass. But today, it carried a new weight. Today, millions had seen the truth for themselves. Rachel Evans broke the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried. This is not just a case of excessive force. This is not a misunderstanding. This is execution. An execution of a man who served this country, killed for daring to question why his tail light, perfectly intact, was an excuse for his life to be taken. She turned toward the jury, then glanced briefly at Judge Miller. And this morning, you saw with your own eyes the same mentality. A black citizen questioned authority in a public space. Officers escalated, and violence followed. The jurors nodded, expressions grim. The parallel was undeniable. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. Her voice, when it came, was low but resonant. What you have just witnessed is exactly why this court exists, exactly why this trial cannot be delayed. My father was not the first, and if we fail today, he will not be the last. Outside the courthouse, chants had already begun. Protesters gathered spontaneously, their voices rising. Justice for Robert Miller. Justice for Judge Miller. Television screens across the country replayed the footage again and again. The nation was no longer a passive observer. It had become a witness, and witnesses demand justice. The silence that followed the playback of Robert Miller's death was unbearable. It pressed against the chest, suffocating. Even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, the courtroom became a mausoleum, every eye fixed on the darkened monitor, every heart replaying the final words of a man begging not to be shot. Judge Cassandra Miller shifted in her chair. The robe on her shoulders felt heavier than ever, as if stitched with every injustice her father's generation had endured. The fresh bandage across her forehead itched, but she refused to touch it. She would not show weakness. Not now. She leaned forward, voice low but carrying through every corner of the packed chamber. This court has seen the footage, the jury has seen the footage, and the nation has seen the footage. Now, it is time we hear from those responsible. Attorney Rachel Evans rose, her palms flat on the prosecution table. The people call Officer Kevin Murphy to the stand. Gasps spread across the gallery. The defendant himself, dragged under the weight of his own camera's evidence. Murphy stood reluctantly, his attorney Michael Richardson placing a hand on his arm as though to steady him. The bailiff led Murphy to the witness stand, where he sat stiffly, shoulders hunched like a man already feeling the bars of a cell around him. Rachel approached with quiet, lethal precision. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but each word was a scalpel. Officer Murphy, she began, how many years of training did you receive before becoming a sworn officer? Murphy cleared his throat. 6 months at the academy, plus field training. And in that training, Rachel continued, were you instructed that civilians have the right to ask questions during traffic stops? Murphy shifted. His eyes flicked to Richardson, then down at his hands. Yes, but they also have to comply with lawful orders. Did Robert Miller fail to comply with any lawful order that night? Rachel asked, her tone cutting through the hushed room. Murphy hesitated. He was argumentative. Rachel tilted her head, her voice sharpening. Argumentative. Officer Murphy, is it against the law to speak politely to an officer? Is it a crime to ask why one has been stopped? No, Murphy admitted quietly. Then tell this court, Rachel pressed. What lawful order did Robert Miller refuse to obey? The silence stretched. The jurors leaned forward, waiting. The camera zoomed close enough to catch the bead of sweat sliding down Murphy's temple. He delayed stepping out of the car, Murphy muttered finally. Rachel seized the opening. Delayed or simply asked why. We all heard his words. Officer, he said, and I quote, "If this is about a taillight, couldn't you just write me a citation?" Does that sound like refusal? Or like a citizen exercising his constitutional right to understand why he is being detained? Murphy's lips parted, but no words came. Rachel turned sharply to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you saw the footage. You heard his words. Robert Miller was calm, polite, cooperative, and for that, he was executed." Murphy flinched at the word executed. Defense attorney Richardson rose suddenly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is using inflammatory language." Cassandra's eyes fixed on him, unblinking. "Overruled. The jury will decide whether the language is accurate." The courtroom buzzed with quiet approval. Cassandra leaned forward, her voice like ice. "Proceed. Counselor Evans." Rachel nodded, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "Officer Murphy, when Robert Miller reached for his wallet, what did he say he was doing?" Murphy whispered. "He said he was going for his police ID. And yet, you shouted gun. Why?" Murphy swallowed hard. I thought he might be reaching for a weapon." "Despite his clear statement," Rachel pressed, "despite his deliberate movements, despite the fact that his hands were visible and his wallet was in plain sight within seconds?" Murphy's voice cracked. Rachel didn't let him finish. She slammed the wallet, sealed in an evidence bag, onto the table in front of him. The thud echoed like a gavel. "This," she hissed, "is what Robert Miller died holding. Not a weapon, not a threat, a wallet containing his identification and photos of his grandchildren. You shouted gun to justify drawing yours." The jury stared at the bagged wallet as if it were a holy relic. One juror wiped at her eyes. Rachel turned back to the bench. "No further questions." Murphy sagged in the chair. His career, his defense, and his composure shattered in full view of the nation. Judge Miller's gaze was unrelenting. "The witness may step down." When Murphy returned to the defense table, his attorney avoided his eyes. Rachel Evans wasted no time. "The people called Dr. Patricia Hernandez, medical examiner." A composed woman in her 60s took the stand. Her lab coat had been replaced with a tailored suit, but her demeanor carried the authority of decades spent with scalpel and microscope. Rachel approached respectfully. "Dr. Hernandez, did you conduct the autopsy on Robert Miller?" "I did," the doctor replied. "Please tell the court your findings." "Doctor," Hernandez unfolded her notes but spoke from memory. "Robert Miller was struck by 3 bullets. All entered through his back. The trajectory analysis shows he was standing upright, with hands raised, when the shots were fired. There is no physical possibility that he was lunging at officers, as claimed." The words landed like hammers. Rachel pressed further. "In your expert opinion, Dr. Hernandez, was Robert Miller's death consistent with self-defense by the officers?" The doctor's gaze swept across the jury, steady and unflinching. "No, it was consistent with an execution." The word rang through the courtroom like thunder. Murmurs swelled in the gallery. Defense attorney Richardson scrambled to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is prejudicial." Cassandra's gavel cracked once. "Overruled. The witness has answered as an expert." Murphy buried his face in his hands. Wilson, pale and sweating, stared at the tabletop as though hoping it would swallow him whole. Rachel let the silence linger before she pivoted. "The people call Detective Rebecca Thompson of Internal Affairs." A uniformed detective walked forward, shoulders tense. She looked reluctant, her steps heavy. Taking the oath, her eyes flicked nervously toward the defense table before settling on Rachel. Rachel wasted no time. "Detective Thompson, when you investigated this shooting 3 years ago, what did officers Murphy and Wilson tell you happened?" "They claim Robert Miller refused orders, became aggressive, and lunged at Officer Murphy with what appeared to be a weapon," Thompson answered quietly. "And based on that testimony, what was your finding?" "I ruled the shooting justified." Rachel nodded grimly. Have you since reviewed the body camera footage we saw today? Yes. And does that footage support the officer's claims? Thompson's shoulders slumped. No. It proves their statements were false. Rachel stepped closer, voice sharp. Detective, would you say they lied to obstruct your investigation? The detective's lips trembled. Yes, they committed perjury and obstruction of justice. Gasps rose from the gallery. The jury's pens scratched furiously across notepads. Judge Miller leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Detective Thompson, why was this footage not reviewed during your initial investigation? The detective hesitated. The officers claimed their cameras malfunctioned. We accepted that explanation. Cassandra's voice hardened. How many other cases have been decided on the word of officers claiming their cameras malfunctioned? Thompson lowered her eyes. Too many, Your Honor. The weight of systemic corruption hung over the room. This wasn't just about Murphy and Wilson anymore. It was about a culture of cover-ups, lies, and indifference. Rachel turned back to the jury, her voice swelling with righteous fire. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard today is not just about Robert Miller. It is about a system that shields those who kill and punishes those who question. 3 years ago, lies nearly buried the truth. Today, thanks to body cameras, thanks to this court, those lies are stripped bare. She looked directly at the jurors, then at the cameras broadcasting to millions. Robert Miller was calm, he was respectful, he was innocent, and he was killed. And this morning, his daughter, your judge, was assaulted in this very courthouse for the same reason, because she dared to assert her right to stand where she belonged. Her voice broke slightly but regained its edge. This is not coincidence. This is culture. And unless we hold these officers accountable, it will continue. Hanana, the gallery erupted into murmurs, some angry, some tearful. The jurors sat stone-faced, their expressions etched with resolve. Judge Cassandra Miller struck her gavel once, not to silence but to anchor. Her voice carried above the noise, scarred yet strong. This court has heard the testimony. This court has seen the evidence. The defense will have its chance. But make no mistake, justice delayed has already stolen 3 years from Robert Miller's family. It will not steal another day. The cameras zoomed on her face, the scarlet bandage stark against her dark skin, the robe framing her like armor. Across America, people watching felt the tectonic plates of justice shift, and the system, for the first time in decades, seemed to tremble. The courtroom air had changed. By the time Detective Rebecca Thompson stepped down from the stand, the atmosphere wasn't merely heavy, it was electric, as though every molecule vibrated with the weight of revelation. No one shuffled papers. No one coughed. Even the clicking of the stenographer's keys slowed, reverent, as if history demanded silence. Judge Cassandra Miller sat on the bench, the black robe draped over her blood-stained blouse, the white bandage cutting across her forehead like a battle scar. The gash still ached, but pain had become fuel. Her eyes scanned the room, jurors tense and pale, spectators leaning forward with clenched fists, cameras fixed like unblinking witnesses. She tapped the gavel once, a sharp crack that brought the chamber back from its stunned trance. The defense may proceed. Michael Richardson, attorney for officers Kevin Murphy and James Wilson, rose reluctantly. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man defending the indefensible. He buttoned his jacket with shaking hands, then walked to the center of the room, turning to face the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice lacking conviction. Police work is inherently dangerous. Officers Murphy and Wilson were required to make split-second decisions in a potentially life-threatening situation. They perceived a threat. Judge Miller leaned forward slightly, her tone cutting like a scalpel. Counselor, be precise. What threat? Richardson froze. He looked at the jury, then back at the judge. The threat of a man reaching for something they believed could be a weapon. Cassandra's gaze didn't waver. You mean the wallet containing his identification? The one clearly visible in the body camera footage? Richardson's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Your Honor, perception is reality in the field. Officers don't have the luxury of hindsight. Rachel Evans shot up. Objection. Counsel is testifying rather than arguing facts. Sustained, Cassandra ruled immediately. Her eyes pinned Richardson. Stick to the evidence. Counselor. The defense attorney faltered, his words collapsing under the weight of the judge's command. He mumbled a few more points about training and uncertainty, but even the jury could hear the desperation. By the time he returned to his seat, the case he had spent 3 years preparing lay in ruins. Rachel Evans rose for her closing argument, the room holding its breath. She approached the jury with the slow confidence of someone carrying truth like a torch. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began. 3 years ago, Robert Miller was driving home from his grandson's birthday party. He obeyed every command. He kept his hands visible. He identified himself as a retired police sergeant. And still, he was shot 3 times in the back while holding nothing more dangerous than his wallet. She gestured toward the prosecution table, where the evidence lay. The wallet, the ID, the photographs of Robert's grandchildren, the medical examiner's report. You have seen the footage. You have heard the testimony. You have watched officers lie under oath, fabricate malfunctions, and obstruct justice. And today, you watched as their colleagues assaulted Judge Miller in this very courthouse for the same reason, because she dared to stand where they believed she didn't belong. Rachel's voice rose, firm but cracking at the edges with emotion. This case is not about one man, or one stop, or one courthouse hallway. It is about a culture that sees black citizens as threats before it sees them as human beings, a culture that punishes questions with bullets and dignity with batons. Her words settled over the jury like a mantle of responsibility. Several nodded, jaws tight. One juror wiped away tears with a trembling hand. Rachel's voice softened, almost a plea. Robert Miller did not get justice that night. Do not let him be denied it again. Hold these men accountable. Show this nation that truth still matters in an American courtroom. She returned to her seat, her body shaking slightly from the force of her conviction. Judge Miller lifted the gavel. The jury will recess for deliberation. The jurors filed out in silence, carrying the weight of both a man's life and a nation's conscience. The gallery erupted into murmurs as cameras cut to anchors providing breathless analysis. Social media surged, hashtags multiplying by the second. Trucks of justice for Miller. Verdict day. Judge Miller. In the deliberation room, the jurors sat around a long wooden table. Robert Martinez, the foreman, a retired history teacher with a calm demeanor, broke the silence. We all know what we saw. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take one. Within 45 minutes, the decision was unanimous. When they re-entered the courtroom, every spectator rose. The sound of shuffling feet filled the chamber as anticipation pressed in like a storm about to break. Judge Miller adjusted her robe and nodded. Has the jury reached a verdict? Martinez stood, holding the slip of paper that felt heavier than stone. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. Martinez's voice rang steady, though his hands shook. In the case of the people versus Officer Kevin Murphy, on the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps, cries, and a swell of emotion swept through the gallery. Murphy's face drained of color. His wife, seated in the back row, buried her face in her hands. Martinez continued, his tone unwavering. In the case of the people versus Officer James Wilson, on the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. Wilson collapsed into his chair, his attorney's hand gripping his shoulder uselessly. The gallery erupted, some weeping, others cheering, many raising fists or clutching each other in disbelief. Outside the courthouse, the roar of protesters reached a fever pitch as news filtered through megaphones and smartphone screens. Cassandra raised her gavel and struck 3 times. Order! Order in the court! The noise subsided, though the energy in the room vibrated like a live wire. She turned to the defendants. Officers Murphy and Wilson, she said, her voice steady as stone. You are hereby convicted of murder in the 2nd degree. Sentencing will be carried out immediately. She paused, eyes sweeping the courtroom, making sure every camera captured her words. This court will not allow justice to be delayed any longer. She turned to the bailiff. Bring in officers Brian Carter and Daniel Brooks. The doors opened, and the 2 men who had assaulted her that morning entered in orange jumpsuits, shackled, their faces pale. The same cameras that had broadcast their violence now recorded their humiliation. The gallery gasped at the sight, as if history itself had twisted to balance the scales. Cassandra's voice dropped into a lower register, thick with authority. Officers Carter and Brooks, you stand charged with assault and battery against a federal judge, violation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead? Their attorneys whispered frantically, but the men knew there was no escape. Millions had seen everything. Carter spoke first, voice breaking. Guilty, Your Honor. Brooks followed quickly. Guilty. A murmur rippled through the room, disbelief at how swiftly the tide had turned. Judge Miller rose from her seat, the robe cascading around her like armor, the blood-stained bandage stark under courtroom lights. Officers Murphy and Wilson, she declared, for the murder of Robert Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years to life in federal prison without parole. Your actions took the life of a man who served his community with honor, a father and grandfather whose only crime was existing in a system that refused to see his humanity. She turned, her eyes locking on Carter and Brooks. Officers Carter and Brooks, for your assault against this court and against justice itself, you are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and permanently barred from ever serving in law enforcement again. The sentences fell like hammer blows. The defendants sagged, their careers and lives destroyed by their own arrogance. But Cassandra wasn't finished. She turned to the cameras, her voice swelling, echoing through the nation. What happened here today is not an attack on law enforcement, she said, her eyes blazing. It is a defense of what law enforcement should be. Good officers have nothing to fear from accountability. Only bad officers do. Justice is not reserved for the powerful. It belongs to all. She raised her gavel high and brought it down with finality. The courtroom erupted, applause, sobs, shouts of relief. Outside, protesters cried tears of joy, chanting Robert Miller's name, chanting Cassandra's name, chanting justice. Inside, Rachel Evans closed her eyes, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Bailiff Harris stood straighter, pride swelling in his chest. Even the paramedics watching from the back row clapped quietly, their hands trembling. For the first time in years, the courthouse didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a temple of justice. And across America, millions of viewers wept, not just for Robert Miller, not just for Cassandra, but for the possibility that, finally, change had begun. The gavel's echo still hung in the air when Judge Cassandra Miller stepped down from the bench. For a heartbeat, the courtroom remained frozen in awe. Lawyers, journalists, jurors, and spectators staring as if reluctant to move, afraid the spell of justice might break. Then the applause thundered again, rolling through marble columns, flooding the hallways, and spilling out into the streets where thousands of protesters had gathered. Outside, the chants of "Justice for Miller" shook the city blocks. Flags waved, cell phones glowed, and people of every background stood shoulder to shoulder in a way that made Chicago feel like the beating heart of a new America. Inside, Cassandra allowed herself a brief pause. She steadied her palm against the polished oak railing of the bench. The robe on her shoulders felt heavier now, but not from fatigue. It carried the weight of victory, of accountability finally wrestled from a system that had resisted it for decades. Her forehead throbbed beneath the bandage, but she welcomed the sting. It was a scar she would carry as proof. Rachel Evans approached quietly, her briefcase at her side. Her voice dropped low enough only Cassandra could hear. "You just rewrote history. Do you know that?" Cassandra gave the faintest smile. "I didn't rewrite it. I made sure it was read aloud." Bailiff Harris joined them, his eyes moist though his stance remained rigidly professional. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I've been in this courthouse 22 years. I've never seen anything like today. You gave people hope. Real hope." Cassandra placed a hand on his arm. "Then let's not waste it." That evening, the courthouse plaza transformed into a sea of candlelight. Thousands held vigil, their flames flickering against the night sky. Reporters from every major network jostled for positions, their microphones catching the chants, the songs, the prayers whispered by families who had lost loved ones to police violence. On a raised platform, Robert Miller's widow, Eleanor, addressed the crowd. Her voice trembled but did not break. "My husband wore the badge for 25 years. He believed in justice even when it failed him. Tonight, I believe he is smiling, because justice has finally come, not just for him, but for every family who has ever been told to be silent." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising as one. In homes across America, televisions replayed the day's events on loop: the assault in the hallway, Cassandra donning her robe while bleeding, the body camera footage, the guilty verdicts, and her fiery declaration that accountability strengthens law enforcement rather than weakens it. Children watched with wide eyes. Parents pointed to the screen and whispered, "Remember this. This is history." By morning, the impact had already spread. In Washington, congressional leaders convened emergency sessions. Senator Elizabeth Warren called it the most significant civil rights trial in a generation. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez announced draft legislation before the cameras even cooled. But the real surprise came from conservative voices. Even senators who had long resisted reform admitted change was unavoidable. President Biden addressed the nation from the Oval Office. "What we witnessed in Judge Cassandra Miller's courtroom represents both the worst and the best of America," he said gravely. "The worst in officers who abuse their power, the best in a justice system that held them accountable, led by a judge whose courage reminds us all of our duty." Across social media, hashtags trended globally. Justice for Judge Miller, Marcus Miller Act, No One Above the Law. Celebrities, athletes, and community leaders amplified the message. Former President Obama tweeted, "Today, America witnessed justice unafraid. Judge Cassandra Miller has given us a roadmap for accountability." Within weeks, Congress passed the Marcus Miller Police Accountability Act. The law mandated a national database of officers dismissed for misconduct, federal oversight for cases involving police killings, mandatory body cameras and immediate public release of footage in deadly incidents, lifetime bans from law enforcement for officers convicted of excessive force. The signing ceremony was broadcast live. Eleanor Miller stood beside the president, clutching her grandchildren's hands, while Cassandra, still bearing the faint scar on her forehead, watched quietly. When the cameras turned to her, she said only, "This is for my father, but more importantly, it is for the next generation, so they never have to stand in a courtroom like I did and wonder if justice will come." In Chicago, the courthouse itself was renamed the Robert Miller Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque was placed in the marble hallway where Cassandra had been assaulted. It read, "Here, justice was tested. Here, justice prevailed." Visitors left flowers, notes, and photographs beneath it, turning the spot into a shrine of resilience. Community programs blossomed. Officers were retrained in de-escalation and implicit bias. Citizen review boards gained real power. And in an irony no one missed, crime rates in the city began to drop, not because of harsher enforcement, but because trust between citizens and police slowly began to mend. For Cassandra, life became both heavier and strangely lighter. Her chambers filled with letters from across the world, from South Africa, where activists drew parallels to apartheid struggles, from Germany, where law students studied her ruling as precedent, from small towns in America, where parents told their children, "Look at Judge Miller. That's what courage looks like." One evening, her assistant Maria entered with a stack of envelopes so high it threatened to topple. "Your Honor, these came today, from as far as Sydney, from school children in Detroit, from police officers in Dallas." Cassandra picked one at random. Inside was a crayon drawing of a woman in a robe with a bandage on her forehead, standing tall while two small children held her hands. The caption in a child's shaky handwriting read, "Thank you for being brave." For the first time in weeks, Cassandra felt tears slip free. She pressed the picture to her chest. But change wasn't only external. Within police forces, a cultural shift began. Young recruits, many inspired by Cassandra's example, openly rejected the old warrior mentality. In a viral TikTok video, a rookie named Janet Martinez said, "I joined to protect people, not to hurt them. If I ever see another officer cross the line, I'll be the first to step in. That's what Judge Miller taught me." Her video spread across departments, sparking conversations once considered unthinkable. At roll calls, commanders reminded their squads, accountability is protection, not punishment. 6 months later, Cassandra returned to the courthouse for a commemoration. The plaza was filled with candles again, though this time they burned not for grief, but for gratitude. Reporters swarmed, eager for a quote, but she waved them off. She walked to the plaque in the hallway, pressed her palm against the bronze letters of her father's name, and whispered, "We did it, Dad. They can't erase you anymore." When she turned back, the cameras were already rolling. Anchor Lauren Mitchell asked, "Judge Miller, when you walked into this courthouse that morning, bloodied but determined, did you imagine the movement that would follow?" Cassandra considered her words carefully. No one imagines being assaulted in their own courthouse. No one imagines becoming a symbol. But history doesn't always ask for permission. Sometimes it demands a choice. And that day, I chose justice. Her gaze pierced the camera, steady and personal. The question is whether we, as a nation, will keep choosing it. In classrooms, children studied her words alongside those of Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall. In churches, pastors cited her courage as a sermon's anchor. In police academies, instructors played the courtroom footage to remind cadets of the line between duty and abuse. The scar on her forehead faded, but it never disappeared. She never covered it with makeup. When asked why, she replied simply, "Because it is not a wound. It is a reminder." That night, as she left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Chants of, "Miller! Miller!" filled the air. A little girl broke free from her mother's grip and ran up to Cassandra, holding a poster board scribbled in markers. "Justice lives here." Cassandra knelt, ignoring the stiffness in her knees, and smiled. "That's right," she told the girl. "Justice lives here. And here." She touched the girl's small chest. "In you." The cameras captured it, and by dawn the image was everywhere. The scarred judge kneeling beside a child, pointing to her heart. It became the symbol of a movement that refused to fade. Epilogue. Months later, during a lecture at Harvard Law, Cassandra concluded her speech with the words that had guided her since the day she picked up her father's robe and stepped into the fire. "Justice isn't perfect. It isn't easy, and it certainly isn't comfortable, but it is possible. Every time we choose accountability over silence, truth over lies, humanity over fear, we make justice possible. My father's death had meaning because you gave it meaning. My assault had purpose because we refused to let it silence us. America is not finished, but it is better than it was 6 months ago." She paused, then smiled faintly. "And better is always worth fighting for." The audience rose in thunderous applause. And across America, people who had once doubted that justice could ever stand against power found themselves whispering a new truth. It can. It did. and it must again. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit like, share it with someone who needs to believe in justice, and subscribe for more stories where truth prevails over power. And in the comments, tell us your city and country. Let's show the world how many of us stand for accountability and courage.